Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of science. My name is Bojan Cestnik, and I welcome you today to today's lecture in the cycle of scientific evenings that are organized and hosted by the University of Nova Gorica. Our guest this evening is Professor Jure Leskovec from Computer Science Department at Stanford University. Before he gives the lecture with an inspiring title, Web as a Laboratory for Studying Humanity, allow me to first briefly introduce the speaker. Jure Leskovec is an assistant professor of computer science at Stanford University, where he is also a member of the Info Lab and the AI Lab. His research focuses on mining and modeling large social and information networks, their evolution and diffusion of information and influence over them. Problems he investigates are motivated by large-scale data, the web, and online media. He received 6 Best Paper Awards, an ACM KDD Dissertation Award, Microsoft Research Faculty Fellowship, and appeared on IEEE Intelligent Systems magazine as AI Stand to Watch. Jure also holds 3 patents. Before joining Stanford, Jure spent a year as a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell University. He completed his PhD in computer science at Carnegie Mellon University in 2008. Jure has authored the Stanford Network Analysis Platform, short SNAP, a general-purpose network analysis and graph mining library that easily scales to massive networks with hundreds of millions of nodes and billions of edges. This was a brief introduction of today's speaker. So please, I invite Professor Leskovec. The floor is yours.
Okay, voila. Super. Hello. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Here's the idea for today's talk, right? So what I will show you today is a set of examples or a set of little vignettes about what kind of research my group at Stanford is doing. And basically the idea will be that today we have this amazing sensor. This sensor we'll call the web, and this web is like a really good sensor in what the whole humanity is doing, right? And then we'll be basically asking, how can we model humans or humanity sort of using equations, using computer science, and using statistical models. And I will show you what kind of results and what kind of claims and insights we can get. And basically, what I won't tell you is how we are able to do these things. So if you want to know how, then go read our papers. Okay, good. So that's a short summary of what I'll be talking about. Okay, so first 5 minutes of, let's call it motivation, right? So if I ask you, what do we have today, right? So one thing that we have today is what I call diverse online computing applications, right? So here on this slide, I have a bunch of little logos of different companies and services, and what all these things have in common, right? Like the online social networks, the social media and blogging platforms, virtual worlds, and online massively multiplayer games like World of Warcraft, and also all the communication tools like Skype. All that these things have in common is that they are basically online computing applications, right? They all run on computers. So that's number one. Number two is that all these applications allow users to have rich and dynamic interactions between themselves and the content that they both produce and consume, right? So this is very different from how we have been thinking about the web 10 years ago when we thought of the web as a static library, right? Where I just go and consume content. Today, on the web, I go, I interact with other people, I can produce content, I can comment, I can review, I can say, I like this, I don't like this, and so on, right? So today, a web is a place where we interact with others and with the content. The second thing is that these things are not used by tens of people, but by millions, hundreds of millions, and in some cases, billions of people, right? So all these things are large scale, meaning we have billions of users. And the second thing is that because all this is going on computers, we have these massive digital traces of human activity, right? So at the end, basically, all these actions that we as humans are performing through these systems are somehow logged somewhere, right? And this really means that today, web is like a laboratory for studying or understanding the pulse of humanity, right? Basically, everything we do, everything we think leaves some digital footprint somewhere, and most often, this somewhere is the web, right? So that's basically the idea. And if I take this kind of digital traces of activity, the most natural way to represent this kind of data is through the network, right? So what I mean by a network is basically a graph. I have a set of nodes and a set of connections or links between these nodes, right? And for example, if I take a social network, then nodes can be people, and edges can connect people that maybe talk to each other, are friends, are in some kind of relationship, and so on, right? So really, the point is that for the talk today is we'll be studying the structure of this kind of graphs, right? So I have a set of nodes, think of them as people, and there are connections, there are links between these nodes, and these links are somehow, again, part of my data. The interesting thing is that there are many different kinds of data that can be naturally represented as networks, right? So, for example, internet, basically the physical cables, how computers communicate with one another, is naturally a network. Citations, meaning scientific papers and which paper references which other paper, that again is a nice network where nodes now are papers and citations now point from one paper to another, and these connections now are actually directed, which means that I know who is the source and who's the destination of the citation. Web, so World Wide Web, again, a very nice graph. Nodes are web pages, hyperlinks link these different web pages. Another interesting thing here is basically that Google, as a company, came out of the fact that they realized that the web is a graph and you can start measuring the importance of the web pages through representing the web as a graph and running a clever algorithm over them, right? The biggest network that we have is actually the brain, right? So that is around 10 billion neurons, 10 billion connections or 10 billion nodes, depending how you look at it, right? So that, again, if I want to study the brain, I would want to represent it as a network of neurons that talk to one another. The other things that you can study as networks are text, cell biology, basically how cell works, how cell divides. You can take nodes or proteins and connect two nodes or two genes or two proteins if they interact with one another, and now we can start studying how cells divide and how they work. Software and, of course, social networks, all these kinds of data can actually be represented as graphs, right? So sort of things that I'll be talking about today are more general and go to other fields of science, not just maybe sort of cute online stuff, okay? And really, if I now want to sort of focus on networks generated by humans, basically social networks, then traditionally this has been pretty much impossible to study. And the reason why it was impossible to study because it was hard to collect the data. And the traditional way to collect social network data was basically to go and run around with a little questionnaire and then ask people, hey, can you tell me who your friends are, and things like that, right? So today, basically the point is that I don't need to do that anymore because pretty much everything we do, everything we interact with other people electronically, either through our cell phones or through Facebook, so I can use that data as a surrogate for the real human social networks, okay? So one important thing here is that in the last, let's say, less than 10 years, the amount of data, in some sense, the resolution at which we can monitor these human interactions has increased several fold. So, for example, between 2003 and 2011, we had access from networks that had 400 nodes all the way today to the 800 million node network, which is the Facebook network, right? So today, Facebook has almost a billion users, right? And the question, what will be one common theme in the talk and in the parts that follow is basically that by having big data, by having access to larger and larger data, I can make more and more precise observations. So basically, I can make observations that otherwise seem invisible to me. So I can spot irregularities or patterns that when I look at too small amounts of data, I just cannot see them. I cannot detect them. They are statistically insignificant. Okay. So if I now want to ask, okay, so how can I study these networks? There are sort of two parts on what am I interested to studying with networks. And this is really now already telling you what will be the structure of my talk today. So really, my talk will have two parts. First, we will be thinking about how do these social networks, how do they grow and evolve, and how links are being added in them and things like that, right? So really, we are interested in how do I study the structure of this wiring diagram, right? The nodes and connections between them. And then the second part that we'll be thinking about is when I say, actually, I will take this wiring diagram, I'll take the network, but now I have some process that unfolds on top of the network. So a natural example here would be that I have a disease or maybe a piece of information, maybe a rumor that spreads between the people. So basically, it spreads over the edges of the network like an epidemic, and I want to study these kinds of processes. And the example here, that basically what we will be studying will be how does information spread? How can I model the spread of information online? Between the nodes and over the edges of the network. Okay, so that's basically the idea. And really, what motivates my research is that I would like to understand why are these networks, why do they have structures that we get to observe, and what kind of predictive and explanatory models can we create for them. So really, the way we are approaching this problem is at three levels, right? So this is a second part of the structure to my talk. So really, both of the two parts will have three subparts, and the three subparts will be the following, right? So the first way how I can approach trying to understand networks is to say, okay, I will study this at the level of observation. So basically, I will develop measurements and, in some sense, procedures that will analyze the data and try to tease out some signal and try to say, oh, this is what's going on in the data. When I know sort of when I do the empirical observations, then I can make a step forward and say, okay, now I want to build a model. I want to build a mathematical model that will explain or reproduce the patterns we see in real data. And then sort of as a computer scientist, right, I want to build new systems, I want to build algorithms, I want to solve problems. So at the third level, we'll be actually talking about applications. So basically, how can I make systems, computing applications that are more useful to the people. And as I said before, a common theme will be that because we have big data, we can observe otherwise invisible patterns or regularities that are just, you cannot see them when you have too few examples. Okay, so here's the first part, right? If I want to talk about network structure and evolution. So here are the three questions that I will be asking, and then I'll give you answers to them. Right, so the first question is, how do social networks evolve, and how do the new edges, how do they arrive into the networks? Second question will be, can I maybe predict what links are going to be created in the networks in the future, and can I maybe predict also the sentiment of the link? Maybe some links are positive, are friendly, and some links are antagonistic, are like enemy-like links, right? And then at the last level, we'll be asking, can I build an algorithm or a model where I will be able to detect groups of nodes, what is called communities, right? Sort of tightly connected groups of nodes that maybe have something in common, right? So these are the three questions. Here are quick answers. So what we will be looking at the beginning is actually the full Facebook data, or at least the full Iceland network of Iceland from Facebook. And we'll be asking about how does this network evolve and how edges are being added in this network. So this will be at the level of empirical measurement. And we will find some cute things, right? That basically most people link through friend of a friend, right? Then what will happen is actually I'll show you very briefly an algorithm that today is actually, or a part of it is used at Facebook today to actually predict links and make recommendations who are the people you may know and who you may want to connect to. And then the next thing we will see is actually we will go beyond just saying who are the people you may know, but we will actually start saying, okay, what do you think of them, right? So not just who you are connected to, but are these people your friends or are they your enemies? So we will make a step further and we will model these networks as if they have positive connections, friendly connections, and negative connections, like enemy-like connections. And then at the last step, we will be going to try to identify clusters or communities in networks. Basically sets of nodes that are tightly connected with one another. Okay, so this will be the first half of the talk, and these are the three parts or the four parts that I plan to talk about. So let me start at the beginning, right? So really, if I want to understand how links are created in networks, first I go collect the data, right? And if I go look at how, for example, Facebook network evolves, the first thing that I observe is that 92% of all the connections that are created in Facebook go through friend of a friend. So what I mean by that is that 92% of connections do something like this green link does, right? So really what this means is connections tend to go through friends that I have in common. And another important thing is that the more friends you have in common with a person, the more likely you are to connect to that person. So there are basically two things. One is that edges tend to close triangles, like I have it here. And then the second thing is that the more friends you have in common, the more likely you are to connect to the person. Okay? So this is at the level of empirical things. Now I can start asking, okay, so how could I use these insights to actually maybe create an algorithm that will recommend who my future friends will be, right? So really what we want to do now is we want to build a recommendation engine that for a given user S, so here my S is this blue node on my graph, I want to predict or maybe suggest who are the people this node S may want to connect in the future, right? So what I would like to do is I would like to think of my graph like I have it here. I have my green nodes, I have my gray nodes, and I would like to somehow rank green nodes to be higher than the gray nodes. The reason why I would like to do this is because maybe I know that in the future my node S will create links to the green nodes. And I'll make it more precise what I mean by that, really. And the problem here is basically how do I combine the node attributes and edge attributes, meaning how do I combine the information I have about the people and their interactions with the structure of the network, right? What I mean by that is how do I put together the information that you and some other node in the network went to the same high school, and at the same time, how do I consider that you have this many friends in common and things like that, right? So we'd like to have an algorithm that will naturally do these two things. And the way we approached this was the idea of what we call the supervised random walks, where people who know what PageRank is, then this is sort of like PageRank, but a bit different, right? So the idea will be the following. The idea is that we will learn a statistical model of friendship strength, right? So really, if this is my node, and for this node S, I would like to recommend friends. First, I will assign weights on the edges of this network, such that the stronger friendships have higher weights. And what I will do then is you can think of it as if I have a little random surfer that walks on this graph, and for every node in my graph, I will ask with what probability this random surfer visits the graph. Visits a particular node in the graph. And then I will just sort my nodes by the decreasing visiting probability, and these are the nodes or the users that I will recommend to a particular person. So really this is the whole thing how the method works, right? So we are assigning strengths to friendships, and then we are thinking of having like a random surfer that walks on this weighted graph, and the idea is that we want to learn such way of assigning edge friendships such that green nodes will be visited more often than the gray nodes. So why green and gray, right? So the setting for this is the following, right? So the experiments we ran was actually, we had access to the full Facebook data. So this was a collaboration with Facebook. We took 174,000 nodes, which means basically 55% of the population of Iceland, so the number of people who declare themselves that they are from Iceland is 174,000, which is 55% of all the Icelanders. The average degree, so the average number of connections is in this network is around 170, and per month an average person adds 26 new friends, right? So the idea will be the following. Our green nodes, sort of what we will do is we'll say, we will take data. In this case, it was from November 2009. We will say these are the people that you create links to in the future, and our gray nodes are the nodes to which you don't link. And then we will estimate the parameters of our model, and then we will try to rank the nodes in such a way that our green nodes come up higher in the ranking than the gray nodes. And the whole idea will be that basically out of 20,000 possible nodes that are friends of a friend, we would like to select a small number of them, usually or typically around 20, and then this is the recommendation that we make to the user and say, hey, maybe you know someone out of these 20 people. And the idea is that if a person adds 20 friends in the future, how many of these 20 did I guess through my recommendation? And it turns out that on average you can predict about 8 out of 20 persons' new friends, right? So if we stop the evolution of Facebook today, I run my algorithm and I generate a list of 20 people, then we wait for a month so that the person adds another 20 friends, and I ask what's the intersection of these two lists. The intersection of these two lists is around 8, 7.6 on the average, right? Which is kind of surprisingly high, right? So basically we can guess 7.6 out of 20 persons' new friends or the friendships they will create in the future. So that's the first point. It's sort of, we are much more predictable than what we would like to think. Okay? So now I can make a step forward, right? I can not just be thinking about who are the people I may know, but actually I can start thinking about the relationships as being positive and negative, right? So positive, you can just think of friendship, and negative, you can think of being an enemy or being a foe, right? And now I want to start asking, how should I think about these networks where now I have every edge can either be positive or negative, right? So really the application for this would be not just predicting who are the people you may know, but actually what do you think of them? You may know that person, but you are not their friend. So maybe you have a negative connection to them versus having a positive connection, right? So really the first question is, I want to have data, or I want to find natural examples of data where I have basically two nodes, A and B, where node A evaluates node B. And this evaluation can either be positive or negative. And actually, there are quite a few cases online where these kind of evaluations between people are naturally taking place. And for the purpose of this talk, I'll talk about two such cases, right? So the first one is a product review website called opinions.com, where people contribute product reviews. And then these users that contribute product reviews can also create positive and negative links to one another, where a positive link means I trust your product review, right? So a positive link from A to B means that A trusts B's product reviews, and a negative links means that they distrust the product reviews. Okay, so there's the first example, and we have 1 million of such evaluations of user A evaluating user B. And the second case is actually the case of Wikipedia, so the public collaborative encyclopedia that everyone knows. Here, there are sort of several casts of users on Wikipedia, and there is a caste of users called administrators. And for you to become a Wikipedia administrator and be able to get some extra privileges, you have to go through a public election process. So basically, there is somebody nominates you to be elected as an administrator, and then there is a public election where other users can come and they can cast votes, and these votes are either in support or against that person being nominated, the candidate being nominated for an administrator, right? So now this again gives me a nice signed network where a positive edge means I voted in support of that person being promoted to an administrator, and a negative edge means I voted against that person becoming an administrator on Wikipedia, right? So now I have my data, so that's great. So now I need some intuition, or I need some framework in which to think about these things. And here's the first way how I can think about positive and negative edges, right? So I can use intuitions like friend of a friend is my friend, or I can say that enemy of my enemy is my friend, or I can say that my friend's enemy is also my enemy, right? So that's one way how I could go and think about these things, right? And if I use this intuition and think about what does this tell me in terms of the network, really these three sentences are statements about triples of connected nodes, right? So in the language of graph theory, these three sentences are translated into triads where I have a connection of 3 nodes, and now I have 4 different ways how I can label a connected graph on 3 nodes with pluses and minuses, right? So, and I basically split these 4 different triads into 2 categories. First, I will call balanced because it's consistent with the intuition that I have above, right? So this means friend of a friend is my friend, while this triad would say enemy of my enemy is my friend, or my friend's enemy is also my enemy. And then I have the other 2, the remaining 2, which are not consistent with this intuition. So this one would say I have 2 friends who don't like one another, right? That's sort of a configuration of the social network that is hard to maintain. And this would be that we have 3 people that all don't like one another, and the idea here would maybe be that 2 of them form an alliance and go after the 3rd one, right? So that's one way how I can think about positive and negative links in networks. A second way how I can think about positive and negative links in networks is to think of this as positive and negative links as being some kind of, obeying some kind of notion of status, right? So if A gives a positive link to node B, that means that B has higher status than A. And if A gives a negative link to B, that would be sort of a statement that A has a higher status than our node B, right? And what is interesting is that these 2 theories actually give you different predictions, or they disagree. So here's an example, right? So if I have a triad like this where A links negatively to X and X links negatively to B, then in terms of balance, I would say enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the prediction here would be a plus. So the prediction would be that A would give a positive connection to B. But in terms of status, status would give me a negative prediction here. It would say that there should be a minus here. Why? Because A says X has lower status than she. X says that B has even lower status. So A has the highest status, B has the lowest status. So if things obey the direction of the status, A has highest, B has lowest, there should be a minus here, right? And this is an analogous example where now links point in the other way. So I could think as friend of a friend is my friend and put a plus here, or I could say B has the lowest status, A has the highest one, so there should be a minus, right? And in some other cases, of course, the two theories will agree. And the question is, which of the two is correct? So really the way you can formalize these two now, really sort of sociological stories into something that you can actually compute over, is to think of this as that we have networks that evolve over time. I have a particular pair of nodes A and B, and there is some X that these two nodes link from, or they are linked to by X. And now at some point in time, A evaluates node B, right? So this red edge occurs. And what I would like to understand or quantify is how does the behavior of node A, basically the sign of this edge AB, depend on the signs and directions of these two edges, right? So really what I would say is, how does the behavior of A change if I know that this edge is created in this kind of context, right? So I have different contexts, I have different types of connections here, so I can have the direction up or down twice, and I can have a positive or a negative edge there. And I would like to say, if I know what is the context in which this edge is created, how does the behavior change, right? And it turns out now that I can say, okay, how many different contexts are there? There are 16 different contexts. Why is that, right? Because every edge here has one of the two directions, and every edge has one of the two signs. So it's 2 for 2 directions, 2 for 2 signs is 4, 4 times 4 is 16. Here are all the 16 cases, right? And now I can say, for example, for each of these 16 cases, this is the edge that appears, right? So this would be A, this would be B. Now I can say by the theory of balance, here is what the prediction of the balance is that users would do when they find themselves in a particular context like that. I hope you can see this, right? So, and then I can see what are the people really doing. And what I find is that for some cases, balance gives me good prediction. So balance means friend of a friend is my friend is a good prediction. And for some other cases, it turns out it gives a wrong prediction. So basically, it predicts correctly 8 out of these 16 different cases, right? But then if I use my status as an explanation, it gives me now different predictions. And actually, these kinds of predictions are much more consistent with people's behavior. So basically, it can predict human action in 14 out of 16 cases, right? So for example, here's an interesting one where I have 2 pluses, but the directions are pointing downwards, right? So under the balance, this would the prediction would be give here a plus because it's friend of a friend is a friend, while under status theory it says B has the highest status, A has the lowest status, sorry, B has the low status, A has high status, so the direction here should be in the decreasing status, so the connection should be negative. And it turns out that in such kind of configurations in networks, people tend to behave and give a negative connection. So why is all this useful? This is useful for 2 reasons. So the first reason is that now we can build very simple statistical models that are actually just asking for a particular, if I want to predict the edge of the sign of an edge, right? So I have my network and I would like to say, are these 2 people positively or negatively connected? So basically, do they trust each other or do they distrust each other? So all I need to know to be able to make these kinds of predictions is in what kind of triangles is this particular edge embedded in, right? So all I need to know is what are the friends that these 2 A and B have in common and what are the directions and signs of these edges. And then I can train a very simple logistic regression, right? So basically something that is so standard that we don't even think about, and that works super well. So it gives me like a 90% classification accuracy. So I can with 90% probability correctly predict the sign of that edge. And what is even more interesting is that I can train my predictive model on, for example, the data, the Wikipedia data, so basically the data that tells me how people vote, and I can use that model to predict how people trust one another and that model works as well as if I would train my model on the trust itself, right? So what is basically the takeout from here is that basically that people tend to behave consistently regardless of whether they are voting or they are saying who they trust or they say who their friends or who their enemies are. At the end, it seems that the same model predicts all these kinds of different behaviors equally well, which seems that there is some underlying mechanisms that we humans use to make these kinds of decisions. So this is sort of what I wanted to say in terms of networks, and links in networks. Now I want to make a step further up and actually start thinking about what is the global structure of these networks. And the way we usually think of networks is that, especially social networks, that they have structures like I show here 3 examples, right? So basically the idea is that I have this, what is called communities. I have sets of nodes that are more connected to each other than to the rest of the network, right? In social networks, this could be, if this is a high school, this could be one class in the high school, and this could be the other class in the high school. If this is a set of proteins in a cell, then proteins that interact together more closely group together in a cluster, and I could say that these are now some kind of functional units or modules inside the cell. If this would be a set of web pages, I could say that maybe these kind of clusters correspond to topically related web pages and so on, right? So really, what I would like to sort of, for us to think about for the next 5 minutes is to think about the structure of networks and how these kind of clusters appear in them, okay? So instead of thinking about individual links, which is what we've been doing so far, now we are thinking about groups of nodes, right? And what I'm showing you here is basically three pictures about how can I think about these clusters in networks. So that's one type of intuition we have about networks. The other type of intuition we have about networks is, especially when I start looking at large networks, is that they don't look like this, that actually they look like that, right? So what is this? This is what is called a nested core periphery structure, or basically what mathematicians call a jellyfish structure, or they call it an octopus structure, right? So really, the way you can think about it is that networks are this, that they have this kind of structure that is like an onion, right? I have this, I have the periphery, and then I have this kind of concentric circles of more and more connections, right? So here I have much less structure than what I was showing you before, right? Before we said, oh, there are these nice social communities. Now I'm saying, no, everything is just a mess, and the more to the center you go, the more messy it is, right? And the question is, basically, how do I reconcile a picture that I have of networks having this kind of structure and the fact that when I go and measure large networks, I get to see this kind of messy things with very little community structure in some sense, okay? So that's what we'd like to say. We'd like to say, especially, for example, if you think of yourself, right, about the intuition for these communities is, if you think about all your friends, it's very easy for you to say, these friends are my high school friends. These are the friends that come from my hometown. These are basically the people I know because I work with them. Right? And this would be the communities that I was telling you about, right? So this could be all your schoolmates, this could be all the neighbors, this could be all the working friends and so on. The thing is, if you look at large networks and start to search for these kinds of things, they look like that. So sort of you don't find them too much, okay? And the idea of finding this kind of this kind of clusters, this goes under the name of community detection. So the way we usually go about this is the following. I take some network data. So maybe in this case, do you guys know DBLP? So DBLP is biographies of all the computer scientists. So basically everything you publish as a computer scientist gets posted on a particular website. So I can use this to create a collaboration network, right? So I can use this data to create a network where every node is a computer scientist, and I connect to computer scientists if they wrote a paper together, right? So now I have a social network of all the scientists who are publishing in computer science venues, and two of them are connected if they wrote a paper together, okay? And maybe I get a network like that. And then I can say, okay, now I will go and identify communities in clusters in this kind of network. And what would I expect these clusters to be? right? In this particular case, maybe the clusters would be that all these people work in the same area and all these people publish in the same journal, or maybe they come from the same institution, same university, and that's why they work together, right? So in this particular case where I take scientists, create a collaboration graph, find densely connected sets of nodes, these sets of nodes could correspond to people coming from the same university, or all people doing AI or machine learning or whatever, and so on. Right? So that's really the thought process I have, or the reason why I want to go find these kind of clusters. Right? So now what we did was the following. We said, okay, when you find the clusters, you have to find the interpretation. And we found networks where actually people tell us what clusters they belong to. Right? So for example, if I take collaboration networks, then really the clusters that I would expect to find would correspond to scientific disciplines or scientific areas. For example, in social networks, the cluster that I would expect to find are all the people that went to a particular high school, or all the people that have something in common, all the fans of a particular maybe soccer team or music group, and so on, right? And now, because you have these labels, you can start asking how do people join into these clusters? And here's the first basic thing you can try to establish. You can say, given that a pair of us belongs to that we have k communities we belong together, what's the likelihood that we link each other, right? So I want to establish what's the probability that there's an edge between a pair of nodes, given that they have k groups in common, that they share k communities in common, right? And the way we think about this today is the following, right? So the graph partitioning idea of finding communities or clusters in networks is that networks have this kind of structure, right? So the idea is that basically every node can belong to only one cluster, and the way I find the clusters is to be able, sort of like, you can think of find a cut in this graph that cuts a few edges for this graph to fall apart into two pieces, right? So that's one way how I can think about finding clusters in networks. The other way how I can think about finding clusters in networks is to say, okay, I will allow these special nodes to belong to two clusters, right, the yellow one and the green one, but these nodes have such a property that sort of if I split them in half, then the network falls apart again into these two connected components, right? So really what this is saying is that the more cluster memberships you have in common, the less likely you are to link. Sort of very counterintuitive. And if you go and measure the probability of a link as a function of number of common communities, the number of common cluster memberships you have, of course it goes up, right? So really what this means, going back to the pictures that I showed you, is the following, is that if I show you here the three pictures of different examples of how can we think about clusters in networks, right? This is the graph partitioning idea. This is the idea of overlapping cliques, or finding what is called articulation points in graph theory. And this is sort of what the graph on the previous slide tells you. And what I have below these matrices, these are adjacency matrices, right? So I have all the nodes here and all the nodes there, and a dot means that node I and J are connected, and no dot means there is no edge between sort of node I, row I, and column J, right? And each of these matrices here corresponds to the intuitive picture up there, right? So if I define network communities like this, I'm basically making an assumption that my adjacency matrix looks like that, right? I have a cluster, and then I have a few connections between the two clusters. If I have this kind of definition of a cluster, then the adjacency matrix looks like this, right? Sort of the two clusters can overlap, but the people that are in the overlap, they don't connect to one another. What follows from the previous slide, from the previous measurement, is that adjacency matrices of overlapping communities look like this, right? Sort of in the overlap, there are more connections than between the nodes that are not in the overlap. So really, this makes it very hard for us to find these clusters, because really, we have to sort of take them apart, right? Existing community detection methods will either think that this is a cluster, or will just think that the whole thing is a cluster, right? So it's different than how we think about clustering today. So the way you now say, okay, given such a graph, I would like to figure out that here are two communities, and I would like to uncover them and sort of take them apart, right? And I have these red nodes that are members of in the overlap, and they have more connections than each of the people that are not in multiple communities, right? So my point is, the world is not like that. The world is like this. The question is, what can I do now? Okay? And the way I can go and attack this is actually to come up with a simple generative model. So the way I can think about this now is the following. Here are my nodes of the network, and here on the top are communities. And every edge means that this node belongs to that community. So green node belongs to community A, and blue node belongs to community B, but red nodes belong to both communities, right? And now the way the social network gets generated is to say, for every pair of nodes, I will create a connection with the probability that I have it up here, right? So the green nodes are connected with probability P sub A, blue nodes are connected with probability P sub B, but red nodes get two coin flips, right? They get a coin flip because they have community A in common, and they get a coin flip because they have community B in common. So red nodes, because they have more communities in common, they are more likely to link because they have two coin flips, so the probability that at least one coin flip will create a connection will be higher than for the guys who have just one community in common, right? And this already satisfies our empirical observation from 3 slides ago, right? So now I have a very cool model of how communities in networks overlap. And what turns out is actually that I can go and feed this model to the data. So what this means is I can take a graph and actually figure out what is the structure of this bipartite affiliation network, right? Where I have nodes of my network, I have communities up there, and every edge here means that community membership. And really what I'm doing now is I'm doing implicit community detection. So now I can go back and say, how do these communities that I identified here, how do they correspond to these real groups that I have in networks? And it turns out that the whole thing works really well. So basically, it works much better than everything that we have today. And another thing that is important from here is basically how I motivated this, right? So at the beginning, I was telling you, networks have no clusters, have no communities. Networks look like this. But then I was going and I was detecting clusters. So really, the way the picture is consistent is to say, yes, from high level, this is how the networks look like. Because communities overlap in such ways that the places where more communities overlap are more densely connected, right? So if I have this kind of flower structure of my communities, there are these super important people that belong to many communities, so they have many edges. So the whole network looks like this, and really the communities fit into this picture in this particular way, right? So really, through this empirical observation and the model, we actually learned about something, how to think about the structure of large networks, right? So, and why is this important? It's important because now I have a much better method to actually go and identify these kind of clusters. As I said before, and hopefully these kind of clusters will correspond to something real in the life. So this is really the first thing I wanted to say. So now we go to the second part of the talk. So if you have fallen asleep, now you can wake up again and we are starting fresh. Okay? So the idea now is the following. So again, the 3 boxes that I had before, just the questions will be different, right? So I have my empirical observations, models, and algorithms. So what I want to do now is I want to understand how does information flow over networks, right? So now I will sort of think that the network is fixed, and I have something spreading over the network. So one question that maybe I would like to answer is, do blogs, right? Do blogs trail or do they lead the mainstream media, right? So blogs are sort of little newspapers that everyone can write. So the question is, because blogs are small, are the blogs first to mention information, or is it actually the mainstream media, sort of the big media houses that are first to come up with some information? So this is an empirical question that we would like to answer. If I'm able to measure this, then I can start saying, okay, who are the key media, for example, for the spreading of technological news? So I can actually start making predictive models that try to capture or sort of quantify the influence of a particular media type on the spreading of a particular types of stories, right? So if there is a political scandal story, then maybe if this appears in a computer science journal, nobody would pay attention to it. But if it appears in a daily newspaper, then maybe that would get more attention or something, right? So that's the question here. And at the last thing we will be asking is really, what are the networks over which information propagates? And we can then use that to make recommendations about what are the news sources you should follow to be most up to date. And the way we will do this is the following. We are collecting, or we are collecting, yes, a big amount of data. So basically we are collecting about 50 million news articles per day. So the analysis I will be talking about here were done on 500 million documents. So basically we pretty much have near complete coverage of US media space. So everything that happens on mainstream media side, but also on the blogosphere. And this will allow us actually to measure and quantify that blogs on the average tend to trail mainstream media with a 2.5-hour lag, right? So at least on the average, blogs are behind the mainstream media. Then, given this, we will be able, I will show you an example of a model that basically, that is able to tell me that for example, technological news, it is the newswire agencies, basically Reuters and Associated Press, that are the most important for the spreading of those kind of stories. And then thing that I won't talk about is basically, then you can develop an algorithm that will be able to tell you or to recommend you which news sites you should follow given your particular interests, right? And that's now an application that you could use it as a news recommendation engine. Okay, so that's the plan for the next 10 minutes, right? So as I was saying before, because everything that happens in media today, or every media site also has a web page or has a news outlet, leaves some kind of digital footprint, we can build crawlers that go and collect these articles. And basically we have a crawler in collaboration with a startup from San Francisco called Spinner, where we are collecting 45 million news articles per day. So basically we get everything that you find on Google News, which is basically all the US mainstream media, and we are also following around 4 million blogs, and we get a bunch of Twitter data and so on. So basically we get a nearly complete or very good picture of what is going on in the US media. And then what this data allows us to do is basically allows us to study, let's call it media ecosystem in United States at large, right? And really the question that we will be asking here is, how does the information that is transmitted by the mainstream media, how does it interact with our personal social networks and so on? And if I really want to ask these kinds of questions, the first challenge that I have to find is, if I want to be able to talk about the information spreading, I need to identify sort of a little piece that is diffusing, that is spreading between people, right? I basically need to identify like a genetic marker of information that then propagates between the people and between different media sites. And we have a little method that basically does something very simple. It just looks at pieces of text that appears inside quotation marks, right? So you have a quote, a few words, and the closing quote. And all we do is we take this 500 million news articles and take out all the quotes, right? So all the quoted phrases. It's really that simple. And then what we do is actually we find, maybe surprisingly, that quotes mutate a lot, right? So quotes is usually, the idea is that it's exactly the copy of what someone somewhere said, right? But actually these quotes change quite a lot from as they propagate between media sites. And we have a way to actually be able, that we are able to identify all the mutational variants of a single quote. So what I'm showing you an example here of is a case where this was done on 2008 US, sort of the US presidential election campaign data, where every note here represents a part of the quote from Sarah Palin about Barack Obama palling around with terrorists, right? And all you see here, basically the edges are some kind of approximate inclusion relationships. So this is sort of, in some sense, it's an ancestry diagram of what piece of information has been derived from what other piece of information, right? So basically, you know, somewhere here are Adam and Eve, and these are all the ancestors and genetic mutants of that original piece of information. And sort of to make the long story short, we have a way to find all the mutational variants of a single piece of information. And what I can do then is just plot what is the popularity of different pieces of information as a function of time. And what is interesting is that I get these sort of beautiful pictures that very nicely summarize what was going on in the media through a particular time period. So this is now the time period around the 2008 US presidential election campaign. And this is a very nice summary of sort of what were the most important points during that election period. And it's about this, I mean, this is Slovenia, so we probably don't remember. But these are, for example, this was the scandal about lipstick on a pig, right? So this was the statement that if you put lipstick on a pig is still a pig, right? And then, for example, here was the spike in terms of the fundamentals of US economy are strong, and then a week later, the entire economy was in danger. And for example, this was the last televised presidential debate and so on. So really, all I want to say here is that using this very simple technique, but using lots and lots of data, you can get a very nice picture of, or some kind of summary of the discussion in the media as a function of time. And the y-axis here, sort of the peak, the height of each peak corresponds to the number of mentions per hour of that particular piece of information and all its genetic mutations. We did a bunch of other analysis here. One was we did it for the news coverage of the last economic crisis. So you can start saying who are the people that get the most media attention for a particular on a particular story or on a particular subject matter. So one subject matter was about economic crisis. The other one was about the sex scandals in the Catholic Church, and see sort of who gets the most media attention on a particular topic. And this kind of methodology allows you to do that. So the second thing I was promising to tell you was sort of this statement that blogs tend to trail mainstream media for 2.5 hours. The way you can establish this is very simple, right? Because what we did was we took for every news source that we were tracking, we said if that news source appears on Google News, then it's a mainstream media site, otherwise it's a blog. And then what I can do is on the x-axis here I have time, the y-axis is the volume, so number of mentions per hour, and 0 is the time when the story gets the most popular, and left of 0 is sort of before the popularity peaks, and the time right of 0 is the time after the popularity peak. And the green is the number of mentions on the blogosphere, and red is the number of mentions on the mainstream media side, right? And there are two observations you make from this. First one is that on average, mainstream media tends to report stories before the bloggers do, and the other thing you see here is that mainstream media is very quick at adopting stories, and it sort of forgets them even quicker, while blogs have much slower decay, which means they sort of tend to discuss and mention things much later after they have happened. However, what is also interesting, you can do the same thing. So the same the same x-axis, 0 is the time of the peak popularity. This is the time before the peak popularity. This is time after the peak popularity. And this is the fraction of blog mentions. So this means out of the total number of mentions of a particular story, what fraction of it came from the blogosphere. So if this thing goes up, means that the blogosphere is making more mentions. And if it goes down, then it means that mainstream media is making more noise or paying more attention to a particular story. And what you see is this kind of heartbeat pattern, right? So you see that before the story gets popular, actually there is a spike in attention on the blogosphere, then the whole thing sways towards the mainstream media side, and then it goes back to the blogosphere. So really what this means is that you have two populations of bloggers. You have professional bloggers who are very quick at reporting stories. You have mainstream media. And then you have the normal bloggers who are very late. Sorry. So what you can do now, can I get some water? Voila. Okay, I need to survive for another 7 slides. So, so here is what I would like to do now. So now I would like to build a model that will basically predict how popular will information get in the future. And the intuition I will be using here is the following. I would like to estimate or answer the following question I have up here, right? So the question is, if New York Times mentions a particular story at time t, how many additional mentions, how much attention will this generate at time t plus 1, t plus 2, right? And then what I will do is basically I will predict the future number of mentions, the future volume of the story as a function of this kind of influence of all the media sites that have mentioned the story in the past. So I'll give you a picture. So here's the idea. I have time, I have number of mentions as a function of time. I would like to predict what will be the popularity of my story in this future time. So this is the line that I have, right? And then imagine that I know that there are 3 websites, 3 media sites, 3 newspapers that mention the information. My newspaper, you mentioned it at this time, V at that time, and W was last to mention it. And then imagine also that for every of these websites, I know its influence function, right? So I know the answer to this question. So whenever node U mentions information, then 1 hour later, this many other people mention it, and 2 hours later, this many people tend to mention it, and so on, right? So imagine that somehow for all these different websites, I'm able to estimate this kind of influence functions. So my prediction of the number of mentions in the future will simply be the sum of these individual influences of different media sites. I sum them up, and here's my prediction, right? So that's my model. What turns out is that this can be super nicely computed. So at the end, all this boils down to a simple least squares regression. So basically, the most simple thing there is, right? And I can discover and estimate the shapes of these influence functions. And here are the 2 important points. So the first point is that this is able to predict the popularity of information very well. Actually, it gives you twice as good performance as if you are using standard time series regression techniques like ARMA or autoregressive methods. The other thing is that you can actually go and examine into what is the shape of these influence functions that you learned. And this is what I'm showing you here. Right? So for example, you can take all the business articles and say, okay, I have different types of media. I have newspapers, professional blogs, TV stations, news agencies, and normal blogs, so personal blogs. And this is time, and this is their influence as a function of time. And what I get to see, for example, is that attention, or the generators of attention for business stories are mainly news agencies, followed by newspapers, while, for example, if I focus on entertainment stories, I see a different type of picture where actually it's blogs and TV stations that are the main drivers or the main predictors of popularity of entertainment stories, right? So basically, through this kind of model, I can now do 2 things. I can learn where it is important for me to get attention to be able for the stories to get popular, and also what is the influence of particular different kinds of media sites. So that is one thing. And then the last kind of thing that you can ask that's somewhat cool is the following. So really what we would like to know is what are the networks over which information spreads? And the problem is that many times we don't know what these networks are, right? So really the problem I would like to solve is the following. I would imagine there is a network like it is here over which the information spreads. But really, I don't get to see this network. I just see the nodes, right? So my nodes are newspapers, and all I get to see is when a particular newspaper mentions a particular piece of information, but I don't know how this information reached that news site, or I don't know what were the connections of this underlying network, right? So somebody got and has hidden all the connections. So really, the point is the following. I just see the nodes, and I get to see the times when nodes get infected by information. Or so the idea is that there is the network that I don't get to see. There is this yellow piece of information that spreads over the network. Nodes get infected by it. I don't get to see who infected whom. All I get to see that by yellow information, node A was infected first, C was second, B was third, and E was fourth. And then maybe there is the blue piece of information that again spreads over the network, and all I get to see is that here C was infected first, A was second, and then followed by B and followed by D. And really what I would like to do is I would like to infer what is the underlying network. So in this case, I would like to infer these kinds of edges and say that yes, A can spread on information from to either C or B, and C tends to spread it to E, and E spreads it to B, and so on. Okay? So the idea is that from this kind of infection data, I would like to infer the network. So this is a version of a more general problem, where basically I can say that there is a hidden network over which something propagates, and all I get to see is the times when when nodes get infected, but I don't get to see who infected whom. So maybe if I think of viruses, diseases, for example, flu-like viruses, then I could say there is the underlying human social network of human contacts over which the disease spreads. I don't get to see this network, but I don't see basically who infected whom, but what I get to see is when people go to the doctor, right? So the question is, can I, based on the infection times of users, can I go and predict or infer what is the underlying network? Or another case that actually we worked on was in the case of word of mouth and viral marketing. So now the idea is that you have people making recommendations to one another, right? They are saying, oh, you know, go buy this book because it's really good, right? And all I get to see is when people go make purchases, but I don't get to see who made the recommendation to whom. Can I figure out what is the underlying network of people making recommendations to one another, right? So these are basically problems that all map on the previous formulation that I gave you. So what are the good and what are the bad news? The bad news is that the whole task, the whole problem is empty hard. For non-computer scientists, this means super bad news. Basically, it means you cannot compute anything. You cannot infer networks that have more than 5 nodes. The good news is that we can find a good network in super quickly, basically in polynomial time, in the time quadratic in the number of nodes in of the network. So I won't tell you how, but I'll show you some results. So here is a result. This is a media network. So every node now here is a different media site. And this is the network we infer based on the patterns of when different sites tend to mention information. And blue nodes here are blogs, and red nodes are mainstream media sites. And what you see from this picture is that basically you get this kind of core periphery structure, the same as I showed you before, but actually interesting things start to happen if you zoom in, right? So this is now a zoom in to that network, to a small part of it. Now, again, I'm showing the same nodes, same coloring. Red is mainstream media sites, blue is blogs. You see the connections. And the other thing you see here is what are the identities of these media sites. And what is interesting is that you get this kind of topical clusters, right? So again, this is American news. So this is a cluster of political blogs or political websites. You have abcnews.com. You have Washington Post here. There is CNN somewhere up here. You have Huffington Post, which is a liberal political blog. You have Guardian, which is a UK newspaper. The cluster up here is entertainment and celebrity news, so basically websites about movies and things like that. And then the cluster down here are the websites about technology, so Engadget, TechChuck, Gizmodo, and so on. Right? And what is interesting from this picture is that different websites take different nodes, take different positions in the network, right? So for example, if you take Huffington Post is very deeply embedded in this political cluster. While if you take, for example, Guardian has a good connection also to the celebrity news or to entertainment. And for example, Salon.com has this connection to the technological part of the world, right? So really, through the analysis of these kinds of networks, you can get a sense of what kind of role are different media sites playing in information dissemination. So this is really the last thing I wanted to show. And all I want to do now is just briefly conclude and tell you what are we planning to do. So really, I was showing you these 3 boxes before, right? So I was telling you about what kind of interesting observations or measurements you can do on the data. I told you about models that are either giving me good explanations or are making predictions. And I also talked about different applications. But really, sort of where we are going in our group is we are really trying to actually, in some sense, actively steer or influence these social systems. So really, what we would like to do, or what our agenda is basically we would like to use social media first is sort of to predict or anticipate population level events, right? So the idea is if the web is really the sensor, then maybe I should be able to detect, you know, the riots that happened in London or something like that. The other thing that we would like to measure and quantify is sort of connection to these positive and, networks with positive and negative links. Really, what we'd like to understand is basically the sentiment and opinion formation. We'd like to identify and know why is there polarization in networks, right? Why do people organize themselves in this kind of camps where, you know, they are all friends among themselves, but then the rest of the world is just one big enemy? We hope to be able to do that both for sort of the news, but also for political type of things. And then the last thing is we are working with quite a few different social networking providers, where basically our question is, how do we evolve or how do we create happy or healthy networks, right? What I mean is, what kind of social network structures are healthy and what kind of social network structures are not healthy, whatever healthy means. Maybe that, you know, users feel happier in this kind of structures versus those kind of structures. Or if you are a company or if you are Wikipedia, how should you organize your social network structure so that good articles get created and things like that. So really, these are kinds of things that, or a few examples of the things that we are working on. With this, I'm done with my talk, and I'll be very happy to take questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Leskovec, for your dynamic and inspiring talk. Now, let me open the discussion with a question. Namely, from your analysis, we can see that human behavior in social networks can be predicted with relatively high accuracy. However, there seems to be a difference in scale. Either these predictions are on macro or micro level. So how do such predictions affect the process of human choice? This is the first question. And the second one, do they diminish the space for human free will?
Wow. Okay, so I think this is an excellent observation, right? So in terms of models, there is this huge, I don't know, like this is a bit technical, but there is this sort of huge discrepancy between models that predict the individual links and models that predict the overall structure of networks, right? So if we would have perfect models, then the model that predicts individual links at the end should give me networks that have realistic structure. But for example, if I would take my Facebook friend recommendation engine and run it for a long time, at the end, actually I wouldn't get a network that has core periphery structure that I was showing you. So I wouldn't get this kind of onion-like structures. So there is sort of, as a community, we are trying to bridge these two things together, but it's very hard, right? If you focus your model too much on the actions of an individual, then from the macroscopic scale, things don't work well. And if things sort of work well from microscopic scale, basically if you are making good on the average, then locally it's totally a mess. So in some sense, I would say, you know, like the other thing I think that's very important here is that we are coming sort of from the AI community or from machine learning community, right? And there we sort of don't care, so we are caring about predictions, but we don't care so much about causality, right? So in some sense, we are happy that there is sort of this signal in the data that tells us what will happen in the future. But we don't know whether that sort of, if somebody from outside comes and tampers with that signal, that the future will change. Right? So, and I think this is an important thing here, is that some cases that I was talking about are more sort of at the level of predictions and not necessarily causal relationships. So I don't know, or it's a good question, let's put it that way. You know, how much, one is that is sort of obvious that there is enough data in networks that we can say what will happen to the future. The question is, can we change the future? That is a much harder question.
Thank you. And perhaps a related question would be, not all the groups of world population are adequately represented on the web.
Yes.
For example, there might be underrepresented groups in geographical areas, like we have seen on the map in Africa, or maybe age groups like elderly people. Are there any limitations of your research studies imposed by such distorted samples?
So, this is, again, a really good point, right? So, in some sense, at the most critical level, right, all that we are studying is how people are using a particular system, right? So, maybe if somebody is very critical, they can even say we are not studying anything real, right? We are just basically studying where Facebook decides to put its buttons, right? I mean, the reality is not so bad. So really, it turns out that these kind of systems give you nice and relatively accurate picture of real human actions. However, there is this caveat that some groups are less well represented, some geographical areas are less well represented. But in particular, for example, for Facebook, at the beginning, the age pyramid of Facebook was very skewed towards young people. But if you look at the age pyramid for the Facebook users today, for example, United States, it's pretty much the same as the population of US. So at least for some nations, the representative sample of people is using these kinds of sites. For developing nations, Africa, Southeast Asia, or Southeast Asia, of course, they have their own social networks. They have their own ways. They have invented their own ways to communicate with one another. And sometimes, maybe Facebook is not the best thing to use. Instant messaging is another example of a very sort of popular social communication network and cell phone communication. So we also work a lot with cell phone data. So basically, that cell phone data is very useful for inferring how people move around and build models of basically human mobility. And they're also interesting for the predicting communication behaviors and so on. So that's another thing.
Thank you. Then I would like to turn to the audience. Are there any questions from the audience? Anyone?
Yeah,
okay.
Yes.
Just wait for a second.
Could you be at least a bit more accurate on what you mean by steering the evolution of the social systems? This seems awfully ambitious task.
I mean, it's good to have ambitious goals, right? And then see what happens. No, but really, so here is what we are doing. The problem with sort of understanding social networks is that network is a set of connected nodes, right? So really, Facebook is just one data point, right? So what we were able to get was a set of 200,000 different social networks, right? So really, what we would like to do now is first build models that for two networks that at some point in time they sort of look indistinguishable, but then one network grows and becomes very popular or very active and the other one dies out. We would like to understand what was different in these two networks that one sort of became successful and one died out. And then the second thing that you can start doing is as an operator of an online community, you have many choices you can make. So for example, these choices are like when new users register, how do you welcome them? Do you assign them like a buddy that, you know, some other person that takes care of them? How many recommendations, how many messages do you send them to? The other thing, it turns out that as networks grow, they have very different structures, right? Sort of what I mean by that is if you have a small network, then maybe you as a creator of that network can interact with everyone. But as the network size gets bigger, maybe you need to start establishing some kind of hierarchy and say, you know, there is me, I'm the boss, but there are sort of people that are responsible to me, and then they deal with the rest of the users, right? So we'd really, in some sense, like to computationally understand these kind of processes, and then at least in the online world where it's very easy to experiment with users, give sort of different experience to different subpopulations of users, try to see what works and what doesn't work. So for now, I'd be very happy if we can, in the online world, understand and make users more engaged. So that's really what I meant by this, right? And every website, you are basically God on that website. You can do whatever you want with your user base, right? So you can experiment. So that's basically the idea. So the idea is really going from this kind of, because everything that I showed you, right, was retrospective, right? You go, you collect the data, maybe you hide some amount of data in the future, and then on the past data, you try to predict this hidden future. But if you can do live experiments, then you can really establish causal relationships, sort of what depending on what you change in the system, what kind of outcome does that give you, right? And that's what I was also talking before. So that is, I think, the answer to your question.
Yes, please.
So this issue of predicting enemies and friends seems like, do you think there's some ethical issues here, or can it be in future projected so that people really take it seriously, and some Darth Vader comes in and decides on whether one is enemy or friend based on the on your analysis or similar analysis?
So this is good. So I'll tell you another story, sort of something I wasn't able to fit in the talk. So one thing, so I was talking about these Wikipedia elections, right? So basically the way Wikipedia elections work, there is a candidate, other users come and they vote on that candidate, right? And a typical election, around between 50 and 100 people come to cast a vote, right? And then based on the outcome, that person either gets promoted or not. So by looking at these sort of networks of positive and negative relationships, by just seeing the first 5 people who showed up to vote, so so we know their identities, but we don't know how they voted. We can predict the final outcome of the election with 75% accuracy. So with 75% accuracy, we can say whether the candidate will be promoted at the end or not. And the way we can do that is just by knowing what is the status of the people that showed up and what is their, in some sense, similarity, so topical similarity to the candidate, whether sort of they worked in the similar areas in the encyclopedia or not. And basically, the way you can make predictions, at least for Wikipedia, about elections without seeing how actually people voted, is that you see that if you get high, so basically the thing is, depending on the similarity, it's like that if people know each other, then they don't really pay attention to the status. So it's almost like if I'm evaluating someone and I know them well, then I don't really care, what is the level of their status. Maybe in academic world, the measure of status is how many papers you published, right? So if I know the person is really good, I don't care how many papers they published. But if I don't know them, if I'm not similar to them, so if I haven't interacted with them in the past, then I just go see how many papers they have and I say, okay, do they have more than me or more than I do or not? And then I give them the vote, right? And this is basically the first intuition that now you can start predicting how people will vote on that candidate, and then aggregating these predictions, you can make claims about what will be the outcome of the election, which is kind of very surprising that, or I find it interesting that you can predict the outcome of the election by just seeing who showed up to cast a vote and not how they voted. And actually, if you would know how people voted, first 5 people, right, you can predict election results with 85% accuracy, right? Because you only see first 5 out of 50. So even after first 5, things can happen. And that's why, in that case, you get 85 and not 100. So I would, in some sense, I would say that because, so going back to the original question, right? These things are very new, right? And really what we have right now is we have this kind of isolated examples, for example, like Wikipedia elections, where we can do, in some sense, surprising things in terms of showing that there is lots of signal or lots of regularity in human behavior. And then the question is, how do these things really translate to real life, right? So when I was saying about, or how general they are, right? Is this just the specifics of Wikipedia, or maybe I could do that for real world elections, right? Like, the one we had in Slovenia, a few weeks ago, right? So that, and again, here, it's not clear what the answer is, but going back to what I was telling you about trying to predict what is whether a particular edge will be positive or negative, there we saw that basically regardless of what is the semantics, what's the meaning of this positive or negative, the same model predicts them equally well, which seems, again, there is regularity in our behavior. So I think what are the, like in terms of applications for these things are especially using them for recommendations, right? Sort of trying to more accurately model human relationships. So that's where I think where these things go at the end. And again, I wouldn't be suspicious or anything. I think these things are here to make our lives easier, and they are doing that.
Any more questions from the public? Yes.
There.
Tom Ilyaš, Artur, thank you very much for this very inspiring speech. As we are technicians and we work in HPC field, my question will be technical. So I assume that you convert your mathematical models into the computer code, and then you apply it on the real data, like Iceland population and so on. So on what kind of computational power are we talking about? Is it teraflop scale or petaflop scale? How do you process it, these models? Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
So the way we are doing these things is basically the last slide, right? We have this code base that we call SNAP, and SNAP means Stanford Network Analysis Platform. So basically we have our own code stack written in C++ or C that is able to do these kinds of computations. At the end, we either do computations in sort of two types of modes. One is on large clusters of machines, so basically like clusters of 500 or 1,000 machines. For those kinds of things, we are basically using Hadoop, which is an open source implementation of MapReduce, for those who know what that means. And then the other thing we do is we have large servers, sort of single machines with 32 processors, half a terabyte of memory, and so on. So the thing with graphs is that graphs have very funny access patterns, right? You really, if you want to work efficiently with a graph, you have to keep everything in memory, in main memory, in RAM, right? So having machines with enough memory, you're able to afford yourself to fit everything in, and then you are able to work with it. So at the end, basically, everything we do is custom built. We don't use any databases, no external tools. Everything is in-house, custom, and then depending on things, it's more or less optimized. But everything is our own. And then whenever we all our code is public, so we tend to release everything. And then also, whenever we help or we have a collaboration with an industrial partner, we also give them our code, and then they usually either use that or they re-implement and so on. So that's how we do it. And that's the only way to do it. So standard things like Python, Java, and so on, that dies very quickly. So you can't do those things.
Thank you. And maybe I have another question. I heard that Stanford University has offered a few courses on videos on YouTube. You told me that this year over 150,000 students participated in such kind of remote learning experience. So can you comment on this initiative a little bit further?
Sure. So I don't know if you know, but in September, there were 3 courses, sort of graduate courses at Stanford Computer Science that they offered them online. So this wasn't sort of just frontal lectures being recorded, but actually they prepared this kind of 10 to 15-minute videos that were released, every day, and there were like online quizzes and so on. So it was a complete experience that a Stanford student gets in the class. The three courses that were offered, one was AI, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, and databases. AI had, I think, 150,000 students, and the other 2 courses each had for around 100,000 students. It was amazing. So it was all offered for free and everything. At the end, people actually even got like a little certificate of accomplishments and kind of report, like a diploma, if you like, or something that said what was their score. There were electronic homeworks and everything like that. Now, so if people are interested in learning things the way we teach them at Stanford, they should go and take these courses. Now in winter, there is another, I think, 8 that will be offered again to the world for free. Again, really, basically these are real courses. So it's not just that somebody is posting YouTube videos, but it's a much better experience. And actually, the news of today is that MIT announced that they are going to do something like this starting next year. So it seems the thing is good if MIT is following us. So that's another thing that we as a university or as a computer science department are trying to do. And now I think like Berkeley is contributing now, I think, to courses and so on. So it's a very nice way for someone to actually see things.
Thank you. And maybe let me conclude with the last question. I'm interested in the principles of collaboration between academia and business in the Silicon Valley. Can you tell us more of the best practices of such collaboration at your Stanford University, and what are your engagements with companies from the Silicon Valley? What are best practices that I said?
Okay. Sure. So I don't know, like, so we are a very small university, right? So Stanford has 6,000 undergrads and 6,000 graduate students. So we are like 5 times smaller than University of Ljubljana. So we are very small, right? But the other thing is that the environment we created or they created around the university is basically the Silicon Valley, right? So there is this amazing energy about creating new companies, and there is amazing support both from the university and also from the people who have money to support these kinds of activities. And then in terms of how the university nicely fits into this is that we actually quite closely work with these companies in different kinds of, in some sense, arrangements. From advising and sitting on advisory boards to encouraging our students to go create companies. I don't know, like Google was one such example where 2 students decided not to finish their PhD thesis and make a company that is now good and big and successful. Facebook is also very closely working with us. They're basically just across from street. Their offices until yesterday were on Stanford land. Now they moved into a bigger building. The way we work is that again depends from basically in some sense it depends between different companies. But the thing is really that in some sense, if a company really wants a good student, we can raise up that student for them in some sense, right? So we work closely with big companies as well as with small ones. So from the big ones, there's Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook, Amazon, a few telcos and so on. But then there are also sort of small startups that we try to help, and the collaborations go both in terms of through courses. So, for example, lots of our courses have some kind of course projects, and then these companies somehow either contribute data or contribute problems that students can work on for the course assignments. For example, I don't know, Amazon is giving us their computing infrastructure so that students have somewhere to work, have computers to work on, and so on. So it's very different. But at the end, right, the idea is that the better connection you have to the university, the more fruitful this is, the easier it is to hire people. Right now, the time in the valley, it's very sort of right, like everyone is really excited there. So there's no economic crisis there, or sort of we are in our own bubble. So in this sense, people are really excited to work on technological problems, and companies are really competing to hire best of our students, both at the level of masters and PhD, and also at the level of undergraduates. So maybe that's. But if you have more specific questions, I'll be very happy to talk more about this. It's very amazing. I didn't know. Like I was super surprised when I came. So I'm now at Stanford for 2.5 years. And I was super surprised how nicely things work there. Also inside university and also the way sort of these industrial sort of collaborations or relationships we have with the industry.
Thank you. I would like to conclude this scientific part of today's evening by inviting you to have a glass of wine and a little snack there. But first, let me thank again our speaker and the guest.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jure, very much. Thank you.